Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and today we're going to be talking about James Clavell's Shogun. So, I read the Blackstone special edition of James Clavell's Shogun. Um, Certainly a big book. This was what I read for March of the Mammoths, along with some other great booktubers involved in kind of a group read for this one. And interesting to hear people's comments about it along the way. Over well over 1,000 pages. What did this one go up to? Almost around 1,300 pages. But this is a beautiful edition. If I open that up, I mean, it is. It's. I think it was around $20 on Amazon. This is certainly far from, uh, something like um, I'm trying. I'm blanking at some of the fancier editions that are out there. But you can see there's some print on there. Beginning of each chapter, it has something similar, or each section. Like here's book one. Right. So it held up to a reading. Certainly. I don't know if it'll be an heirloom piece or anything like that, but I certainly liked it. And here's the back. You could see. A very beautiful edition. And I have to say, I was, for the most part, highly impressed by this book. At first, I was debating on whether or not I was going to join this buddy read. I had some other things that I was originally planning on reading for March of the Mammoths, mostly some nonfiction. But I wanted to read more historical fiction this year, and I teach middle school and middle school social studies, and I do have a unit on Japan. And it just so happened that we're going to be talking about samurai right around the time that this book was being read. I thought, okay, perfect timing. Basically, the planets are aligning. I might as well jump on this read. And this is a fictionalized account of a real life Englishman who ended up going to Japan and becoming a samurai. I'm not going to get into all the background history of that. I'm really just going to kind of give a fairly spoiler-free discussion of the novel itself. Inside this novel, the Englishman is named John Blackthorne, and he is sailing for the Dutch. And their biggest enemies at this point are the Catholic powers of Spain, and Spain had recently taken over Portugal as well. And the Portuguese in particular have already gotten a foothold into Japan and made some religious conversions. And this takes place in 1600. So it's before the period of isolation. Tokugawa has been renamed Toranaga in this. And the renaming does help, I think, free James Clavell of having to be slavish to historical events. So he does put a lot of good history in here. I think that we get an excellent flavor of feudal Japan, certainly. But at the same time, I was aware that I had to take certain things with a grain of salt. There were certain historical things that I think were either inaccurate, or you have a feeling sometimes of anachronisms occurring. But I'll get to that stuff in a little bit. Essentially, we have John Blackthorne. His ship crash lands, essentially, on the shores of Japan, along with his crew. And at first, they are dealt with pretty severely and inhospitably. But John Blackthorne, over time, he does learn the Japanese way. He earns the respect of the Japanese, and of course, he does achieve some pretty significant power within Japan. The first half of the novel is really fish out of water. It is John Blackthorne trying to figure out Japanese ways and learning Japanese language and customs and mores. And that stuff is actually a lot of fun. There's a surprising amount of humor in here. There is, I think, at least in the first quarter, a certain pulpiness to what occurs. I get a sense of his writing style, Clavell's writing style, changing a little bit from the first part. I do think in the first part of the novel, he does fall into certain stereotypes, you know, we things that this was written in the mid 1970s, things that were maybe more influenced by Hong Kong cinema than they were actual historical accounts. And I don't entirely blame Clavell for that. I think that there has been a lot of historical confusion with regard to feudal Japan uh, on many subjects. Some of it being the samurai, and especially when it comes to things like ninjas, which make their appearance in here. There is a large debate about what exactly these historical figures were and did, and even with regard to Bushido, which seems to have meant different things at different times to different people. And of course, looking back on this, we really have the baggage of what we have here is a Westerner's view. Clavell was a prisoner of war in World War II. So we should, I think, understand that, right? Prisoner of war with the Japanese. Okay, so he was being held prisoner by the Japanese. I think that some of the way that the Japanese are depicted is through that lens of experience of World War II, which might not entirely accurately reflect Japan in 1600. I can't get into specifics with all of that, and again, I don't claim to be an expert in any of this stuff. This is just based on the reading or research that I have done. This is the impression that I was getting. We have a scene early on in here. Again, these aren't really spoilers. These are just little scenes. They don't give away huge plot points or anything. Where Blackthorn is very quickly incapacitated by like a Japanese peasant by martial arts and pressure points, basically. Something that, again, you would see in like a movie, not something that would have been occurring necessarily in like 1600 Japan. Anybody who watches, MMA knows that you don't just incapacitate people with pressure points. And that's something that, again, I bring this up because it doesn't occur at any other point in the novel. In the very beginning, we have things like comments on Blackthorn's the size of his member and how impressed the Japanese are by it. Certain things you're kind of like, okay, this is kind of a very stereotypical sort of West meets East sort of thing that's occurring here. And although those sections are fun, and sometimes they're very funny as well, intentionally funny, I did fall into, it did feel like it was falling into either anachronisms or stereotypes, that sort of thing. That stuff does largely go away, though, as the story progresses. The first half is fast moving. It is fun. The action scenes are great. The characters in here are excellent. Clavell really writes well-rounded characters that feel real. They feel like real people. And not just Blackthorn. We have, like I said, Toranaga, but we also get a character, Mariko, a Japanese woman who has converted to Christianity, Catholicism. And her character is also excellently written. Very good. All the characters in here are wonderful. And I think that's one of the main reasons for reading this, is that the character development. Now, as I said, the first half of the book is really kind of more fish out of water. The second half of the book, it gets more into the political intrigue of Japan. And Blackthorn himself, he kind of moves from the forefront of the story to kind of a little bit more in the background. And Japanese characters start to take the forefront. And we start seeing them much more extensively. Much more time is taken up with their dialogue. And I'm still invested at this point. I do have mixed feelings about the ending of this book. And again, I don't want it to be spoilery. It feels like the book is constantly building up to a certain confrontation. A confrontation which ultimately never occurs. There is a point at this book where we have an introduction of peripheral members of Japanese society. So, like I already mentioned ninjas before. There's a ninja scene in the beginning of this that really doesn't need to be there. It's just to let you know that ninjas exist in this. And again, ninjas, historically, there's a lot of debate over them. They're really more shinobi. What we see in here is kind of a very kind of Hollywood version of ninja, it seems. And then ninjas come once again into the scene later on in the story. And I don't want to talk about what happens there, okay? But it feels like, okay, there's this big kind of intense action scene that involves ninjas. They kind of leave, they kind of come, they leave, they go, they disappear again. And ultimately, again, it feels like they don't really need to be there. Each time the ninjas show up, I feel like the story is actually kind of being halted rather than progressed. And you don't realize that you're actually reading the climax of the novel because there's still like a couple hundred pages left. And after that point, it still feels like the novel is building up to this major confrontation that they keep alluding to and talking about. And what you're actually reading, though, is basically a several chapter long epilogue. Once that realization started to hit me, I did feel a little bit disappointed, I have to say. So, again, I'm trying not to be spoilery with this. I did like this book. I thought that it was, once again, the writing itself was really good. The dialogue was quite good. The characters are excellent. There are some really good scenes in here. Some genuinely funny humor as well. It does help me, I think, understand Japanese feudalism a little bit more than I did before. Although people are committing seppuku at alarming rates inside this novel, it makes me, I mean, I know it was a real thing, but it does make me wonder just how frequent it would happen, because it feels like it would be very difficult to have a rigid feudal society when people are just basically offing themselves at just these alarming rates. Almost, yeah, it seems like on a daily basis. I'm not sure how you can maintain that kind of structure. So again, it feels a little bit exaggerated at that point. So would I recommend this? Absolutely, I would. I did think that it was really good. I do think that you should take the history, again, with a grain of salt. This is, once again, Clavell, an outsider, is 1970s, and their depiction of feudal Japan. It makes for a great yarn, a great story, oftentimes a really exciting one, but it is, of course, not a history book. So, yes, I'm glad that I read it. I enjoyed the group that I read it with, and this is a beautiful edition in which to read it. So if you've read it, I'd love to hear your comments, your thoughts. Again, trying to avoid any kind of spoilers in case anybody reads it. But any kind of respectful dialogue, I certainly would appreciate. All right, so anyway, as always, thank you, BookTube.